My name is Jill Ross. I teach here at the University of Toronto at the Centre for Comparative Literature and the Centre for Medieval Studies. Like last night, we will not be taking questions after our keynotes, and my introduction of our two eminent keynote speakers will be in the order in which they will be speaking. It's my pleasure to introduce our two very eminent keynote speakers, David Wallace and David Palumbo-Liu, who will, from seemingly remote points in time and space, address the topic of this session, positioning Europe and the problems of globality. In organizing this keynote session, we wanted to see if scholars operating at opposite ends of the modernity-pre-modernity divide My name is Jill Ross. I teach here at the University of Toronto at the Centre for Comparative Literature and the Centre for Medieval Studies. Like last night, we will not be taking questions after our keynotes, and my introduction of our two eminent keynote speakers will be in the order in which they will be speaking. It's my pleasure to introduce our two very eminent keynote speakers, David Wallace and David Palumbo-Liu, who will, from seemingly remote points in time and space, address the topic of this session, positioning Europe and the problems of globality. In organizing this keynote session, we wanted to see if scholars operating at opposite ends of the modernity-pre-modernity divide could speak to each other. Maps, the subject presumed by the conference theme, bring disparate places into relation. Maps are, of course, shaped by both the cultural and temporal positioning of the one who does the mapping. We hope that considering mental and literary maps in different times as well as different places would teach us. My name is Jill Ross. I teach here at the University of Toronto at the Centre for Comparative Literature and the Centre for Medieval Studies. Like last night, we will not be taking questions after our keynotes, and my introduction of our two eminent keynote speakers will be in the order in which they will be speaking. It's my pleasure to introduce our two very eminent keynote speakers, David Wallace and David Palumbo-Liu, who will, from seemingly remote points in time and space, address the topic of this session, positioning Europe and the problems of globality. In organizing this keynote session, we wanted to see if scholars operating at opposite ends of the modernity-pre-modernity divide could speak to each other. Maps, the subject presumed by the conference theme, bring disparate places into relation. Maps are, of course, shaped by both the cultural and temporal positioning of the one who does the mapping. We hope that considering mental and literary maps in different times as well as different places would teach us not just about those times, but also about the nature of our maps. David Wallace is the Judith Rodin Professor of English at the University of Pennsylvania, where he was chair from 2001 to 2004. He has been visiting professor at King's College London, at the University of Melbourne, at Princeton, and most recently at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. David is a medievalist whose current work looks forward to the early modern period, but is also attuned to the claims made by the pre-modern literary imagination on the modern mappings of space, politics, and culture. David's work crosses boundaries of language and discipline. He's a specialist in English and Italian literatures, with additional interests in French and German. He's the author of numerous books, among which are Chaucer and the Early Writings of Boccaccio, published by Brewer in 1985, Giovanni Boccaccio, The Decameron, Cambridge, 1991. He's the editor of the Cambridge History of Medieval English Literature in 1999, and co-editor of the Cambridge Companion to Medieval Women's Writing that came out in 2003. Also co-editor of Bodies and Disciplines, Intersections of Literature and History in 15th Century England from the University of Minnesota Press in 1996, and co-editor of Medieval Crime and Social Control from the University of Minnesota in 1998. His book Chaucerian Polity, Absolutist Lineages and Associational Forms in England and Italy, published by Stanford in 1997, won the Lowell Prize for the Best Book of the Year by an MLA member in 1998, and this prize was presented to him personally by Edward Said. His most recent book is Strong Women, Life, Text, and Territory, 1347 to 1645, published by Oxford in 2011, and just released in paperback this spring. In his book, Pre-Modern Places, Calais to Suriname, Chaucer to Afrabeen, that came out with Blackwell in 2004, he engages with the idea of place as what David Palumbo-Liu would call an affect delivery system that is both geographic site and, to quote David Wallace, ideas, dreams, and feelings about places, end quote. Feelings which are indelibly colored by the properties of history, histories of slavery, of trade, of national boundaries and character, of imperialism, and of race. David continues his focus on opening up new transnational itineraries of interconnected places in a huge project that he is directing and editing at Oxford University Press, supported by the Guggenheim Foundation. This project will be the first literary history of medieval Europe, organized by sequences of places that emphasizes a multi-centered Europe in which European space becomes intelligible only through dialogue with that which forms its outside. And we will be hearing more about this project shortly. Our other keynote speaker tonight, David Palumbo-Liu, the Louise Hewlett Nixon Professor and Director of Comparative Literature at Stanford University, is a scholar of social and cultural criticism, East Asian and Pacific American studies. His 6 books cover all of these fields. In 1993, he published The Poetics of Appropriation, the literary theory and practice of Huang Tingjian, 1045 to 1105, with Stanford. In 1999, his book, Asian/American Historical Crossings of a Racial Frontier, came out with Stanford and was awarded the distinction of Outstanding Academic Book Title by Choice. He has several edited volumes, The Ethnic Canon, History, Institutions, Interventions, that was published by Minnesota in 1995, Streams of Cultural Capital, Transnational Cultural Studies, that came out with Stanford in 1997. His book, Emanuel Wallerstein and the Problem of the World, System, Scale, Culture, a co-edited anthology of essays published by Duke in 2011, problematizes paradigms of world interconnectedness that rest on questionable assumptions and seeks to make room for competing conceptions of the world, a process that is predicated on a more effective telling of larger stories about the world. In his own piece in this volume, David calls for a politically and ethically informed rethinking of the humanities that takes into account the ethical imperatives that bind peoples and cultures across space and time. Like David Wallace, whose work both sutures and calls attention to disjunctures between pre-modernity and the modern, David Palumbo-Liu engages with the problematic dialectic of negotiating between common sets of knowledge, desires, and a social imaginary that provides an intersubjective ground between peoples and cultures. And he engages with the need to localize, historicize, and racialize such commonalities. His most recent book, The Deliverance of Others, Reading Literature in a Global Age, that came out with Duke in 2012, reappraises the idea that narrative literature can expand readers' empathy and argues for the importance of affect in the media and globalized discourses through which others are delivered to us in terms that we can recognize. Both Davids have reflected deeply on what is at stake when and in how we choose to locate ourselves within webs of imaginative voices and texts, European and global, past and present. Please join me in welcoming our 2 keynote speakers.
Okay. Well, I'd first like to thank Neil Ten-Cortonar and the ACLA for inviting me here, and Jill Ross for her very kind introduction. I'm honored and delighted to address you today, and it's a special honor to share the podium with David Wallace. He and I have benefited from the ACLA's choice of pairing our work together And he's absolutely right. We had this very serious and responsible scholarly exchange. But what he omitted to say was before we did that, we were Facebook friends, which I now know dates us. I mean, in any case, I also want to thank Carolyn Egan for taking me into Presley land, which we're about to go to. Her design perfectly complements the talk I'm about to give. Technologically challenged as I am, I could not have done this without her, and it's probably going to be the best part of my talk. Although David's talk covers in an immensely impressive and erudite manner the attempts to conceive of and compose a literary history of Europe, and mine is a much more modest enterprise, a limited readings of texts, I think it's safe to say that we have several shared concerns. Primary among them at this conference on global positioning systems is the issue of the genesis of any systematic understanding and codification of literary production, which of course raises the question of what exactly literature is. I was especially struck by David's account of the various starts and stops, ponderings, reworkings, reimaginings of what or where Europe might be or when history might begin. I believe David and I share an interest in momentarily setting aside the automatic granting of significance to any specific designation of beginning. We see rather the multiple other possibilities and both the reasons for settling on one point rather than another, and also the consequences of so doing. I would add for the purposes of today's conference that we might very well apply the same kinds of critiques and skepticisms and intellectual and imaginative reconceptions to the idea of systems, especially those that locate and position us in relation to each other and to the worlds that we live in. In sum, we want to ask, why would an investigation into the cartographies and timelines of literary production and contemporary histories of locating and placing people and peoples differentially and relationally within systems that call themselves global matter to our understanding of ourselves and our choices of acting one way or another toward other people? It is that difference-making differential that I want to bring forth in my remarks on systems, and I underscore the plural here, systems, and positionings in what appears to be global for one reason or another, at one place or another, at one time or another. So when David writes of, quote, a decentering and pluralizing of Europeanness, I'm deeply intrigued, for I think we both know how both critical and real this is, and also the difficulties of imagining how that actually might come about, tracking it responsibly, so to speak. Inspired by that phrase, decentering, I finally came up with the title of my own talk. As you all know, that's the last thing you come up with, is the title. And so I want to thank David Wallace for pointing me in what really is the most important aspect of our conversation tonight, I think. Now, the moment I started the assignment of writing this address, taking into account both its theme and the plenary honoring Edward Said, I immediately thought of an incident that I've written about previously. Edward Said was invited to give the Ian Watt lecture at Stanford, and he was introduced by none other than Ian Watt. And Ian Watt praised Edward and said marvelous things about him, but the thing that he centered on and really drove home was that he said, you know, Edward, what I appreciate most about Edward is the lucidity of his writing. He's not like these theorists with this gobbledygook that you can't understand. You know, Edward's writing is lucid and precise. And then he went on to say he attributed that entirely to the fact that Edward Said had got a, quote, good British education. And I must not have been the only person in the audience who would wonder, you know, what Edward Said would say to that. And what he said was typically Edward Said. He thanked Ian very graciously, and then he said, but you know, Ian, some of us were caned if we didn't speak English correctly. And as I wrote then, what Watt chose to emphasize as a point of commonality, of sociability, was a discourse that allowed him to imagine Said as part of a particular fraternity. Watt's pronouncement indicated that he and Said were brothers, not only in the English language, but also in a particular usage of it within specific intellectual protocols. For Watt, this bond transcended the particularities how each came to write English. But for Said, such an affinity could not so easily erase historical specificity, a specificity that challenged the notion of a seamless social bond produced by a common language and a shared sensitivity about its proper use. One of the points I want to bring forward today is that any reputably global system is open to being incorporated into uncommon usage, and that in that repurposing, its own claims become examinable in a new light. Not only that, but we must acknowledge the co-presence and uneven overlap of multiple global systems, whose actual, more realistic and modest particularities are often covered over by both real and aspirational differences of power. In a well-known passage in his autobiography, Said elaborates the rather complex issue of his acquisition and practice of language. The way he does so is to lay before us the locating and positioning function of language and languages that ultimately locate him in an uncomfortable and unhomely terrain, one in which the global is explicitly denied. He writes, quote, "With an unexceptionably Arab name like Said, connected to an improbably British first name, parentheses, my mother most admired Edward VIII, the Prince of Wales in 1935, the year of my birth, I was an uncomfortably anomalous student all through my early years. A Palestinian going to school in Egypt with an English first name, an American passport, and no certain identity at all. To make matters worse, Arabic, my native language, and English, my school language, were inextricably mixed. I have never known which was my first language, and have felt fully at home in neither, although I dream in both. Every time I speak an English sentence, I find myself echoing it in Arabic, and vice versa." Now, when I read that, I immediately thought of Anton Shammas's brilliant novel, Arabesques, written by a Palestinian Christian in Hebrew. At one point, a character declares her love. Quote, "You know, I'm half Arab," Amira says, "because the creative side of my mind comes from Alexandria. I love you in a Jewish way, but I write about it in an Arab style. I used to write to my father in Arabic, and he would answer me in French, but you could sense the smells of the beach of Alexandria behind his words, and also the smells of my mother's kitchen. I don't understand everything he wrote, but the dried-up stream of his Hebrew somehow flowed into my Arabic." Now, how to map that, how to center that, how to conceive of that as a world. The text I wish to allude to today take on the issue of location and the dissonance created between the different systems in which they are positioned, temporally, spatially, historically, geographically. I'm going to argue that the problematic of locating oneself in a global system is perceivable in local instantiations, and yet the position one occupies is reliant on multiple points of view and angles of perception. Now, I was never one of those critics or theorists who felt that there is a literary system. If there is one, it's a very inefficient one for sure, designed by its very nature for failure, for in these and other texts we find the straining of the very notion of systems. This stress factor, I argue, can be interpreted as the imprint of doubt, of skepticism, critique, resistance, some of which is successful in challenging the system, some not. But they all try to move the center. These texts gesture toward visions and aspirations to be other than systemic, or let's say they point to a relation of tension between themselves and any binding systematic account of itself. They point to the strengths and weaknesses of the systems in which they are positioned. Now let's remember how GPS works. One's location is determined by the drawing together of at least 3, if not 4, satellite feeds, each one transmitting its position from the heavens to one's minuscule little positioning device that then synthesizes these different satellite positions and comes up with its location on Earth. My humble iPhone now attaches me to distant orbits and systems of references. I am located on Earth, but only by first drawing on multiple different positions from within the positioning system. I hasten to add the system is one over which I have no control. The location here on Earth, as determined by the positions of these satellites, demands that we recognize that location on Earth is derivable only by integrating ourselves into a global positioning system, and if that's not mind-bending enough, our earthly location is knowable only by reference to something both outside ourselves and something that we cannot possibly see. We simply blindly trust it. Something especially dangerous if you're using Apple Maps. Silicon Valley joke. Okay. Again, I'll be asking us to imagine the work of contemporary literature as having something to do with both intuiting these invisible systems and imagining otherwise in extra systemic ways. So, let me start with a literary allusion that I'm sure you all know. An instance of a young Irish lad puzzling out his status within the British Empire and the world. The way he will attempt to do so is through the vehicle of an aesthetic life that will take him beyond the geographies in which he is located. From that position, he will launch his attempt to forge the uncreated conscience of his race. Let us not forget that the publication date for Joyce's portrait of the artist as a young man is 1916, the year in which the Easter Rising took place in Dublin. Joyce then was writing at a moment of immense historical and national crisis. And he was also writing a lyrical and aesthetic document of his personal perception of his time and place. Now look at the moves he makes in this early famous passage. Here he conveniently disappears the British crown and in fact begins with an allusion to its former colonies. Now here's Stephen Dedalus' global positioning system. He opened the geography to study the lesson, but he could not learn the names of places in America. Still, they were all different places that had different names. They were all in different countries, and countries were in continents, and continents were in the world, and the world was in the universe. He turned to the flyleaf of the geography and read what he had written there himself, his name and where he was. Stephen Dedalus, Class of Elements, Conglo's Wood College, Solins, County Kildare, Ireland, Europe, the world, the universe. There's a lot to comment on in this passage, but rather than dwell on this passage, I read it to get to another one, moving along the satellite feeds. This one comes 70 years later from another artist. She begins by likening herself to a bumblebee that has infiltrated her living room. Quote, "It is looking for what it needs, just as I am, and like me, it has gotten trapped in a place where it cannot fulfill its own life." How Joycean. The writer continues, "And I, too, have been bumping my way along glassy panes, falling half-stunned, gathering myself up and crawling, then taking off again, searching. I don't hear the bumblebee anymore. I leave the front door. I sit down and pick up a second-hand, faintly annotated copy of Marx's The German Ideology, which happens to be lying on the table. I will speak these words in Europe, but I'm having to search for them in the United States of America. When I was 10 or 11, early in World War II, a girlfriend and I used to write each other letters that we addressed like this. Adrian Rich, 14 Edgevale Road, Baltimore, Maryland, the United States of America, the continent of North America, the Western Hemisphere, the world, the Earth, the solar system, the universe. Rich follows with two sentences that take us into her global positioning system. Quote, "You could see your own house as a tiny fleck in an ever-widening landscape, or as the center of it all, from which the circles expanded into the infinite unknown. It is that question of feeling at the center that gnaws at me now. At the center of what? As a woman, I have a country. As a woman, I cannot divest myself of that country merely by condemning its government or saying 3 times, as a woman, my country is the whole world. Tribal loyalties aside, and even if nation-states are now just pretext used by multinational conglomerates to serve their interests, I need to understand how a place on the map is also a place in history, within which, as a woman, a Jew, a lesbian, a feminist, I'm created and trying to create. Now, we can assume that Rich probably would have known the resonances of Joyce that she had evoked, but not necessarily. Or perhaps she precisely chose not to explicitly allude to Joyce's text. Perhaps the two efforts at locating oneself are quite different, but what does it matter? For can't we see these as two textual satellites, that whether or not they refer to each other explicitly are now points of reference for us as our eyes dwell on the interlinear spaces of one or another of them? Each text is joined to the common problematic of locating oneself, and critically, from that point of orientation, acting in the world from that particularly located point in geography, gender, race, history. The issue set before us is that each poetic fragment is situated simultaneously in the local and the universal. The gradual movement of the line of reading does not erase the words before it, but rather gathers it into a simultaneity. We're both at 14 Edvale Place and the USA and the world, and also at the same time at Conglows College, County Kildare, the universe. The global literary position merges both Joyce and Rich into the universe, whatever that is, but they each bring with them their very specific local addresses and inescapable matters of concern. This means they are both contained within these spheres, but also are dynamic forces in the reimagining of the precise nature of their universes or globalities. And as we comparatists now weigh and measure anew what the system of positioning might be that has just been brought into existence, we start doing the work of comparative literature. Let me underscore they become part of a positioning system that we take an active, imaginative part in forming, as opposed to and differentiated from, at least provisionally, in our pedagogical and intellectual spaces as teachers and researchers of comparative literature, those other systems of power that position us in their informational grids. This would oblige us to use our imagination to forge a discourse different from the one that Dennis Cosgrove describes in his masterful work, Apollo's Eye. In a passage worth quoting at length, Cosgrove writes, quote, "Overwhelmingly Western in both origin and access, these systems have been readily incorporated into the American globalist discourse initiated in the 1940s and elaborated in the rhetoric of the space race. In the 1990s, American Vice President Al Gore regularly represented information technologies as the foundation of a global participatory democracy. Quote, the Global Information Infrastructure, GII, will be an assemblage of local, national, and regional networks. The GII will circle the globe with information superhighways on which all people can travel. The GII will be a metaphor for democracy itself." Similarly, Bill Gates has celebrated what he calls a frictionless capitalism. And when you hear that phrase, I can't think of the famous phrase from The Fear of Flying. You can look that up. Frictionless I'm glad somebody got it. Right, frictionless capitalism. In the great planetary marketplace, this is Gates, as we social creatures will sell, negotiate, invest, bargain, choose, discuss, stroll, meet, quote, such proclamations, this is Cosgrove again, such proclamations stand squarely in the tradition of universal association, which from the time of Alexander the Great has followed the dream of imperium. In projecting ideas and beliefs forged in one locale across global space, the liberal mission of universal redemption is inescapably ethnocentric and imperial, able to admit other voices only if they speak and are spoken by the language of the self-denying center. Claims that cyberspace, the internet, new hybridities, quasi-objects, or cyborgs will offer genuine polyvocality and equivalence must therefore be treated with some skepticism in the light of the genealogy of the Apollonian vision. End quote. In Joyce and Rich, we've seen two early differential mappings of location and position, each marking a countervision to the one just mentioned by Cosgrove. Now let me give two other examples of a counter-imaginary mapping. Both come from Amitav Ghosh. The first one is from his novel, The Shadow Lines. Here the narrator conceives of an entirely different way of mapping the area of his country and its global relations by moving the center, and listening to David's talk, I could not help of thinking of this passage in particular. The narrator begins by comparing the relative proximity of Khulna in Bangladesh to Kolkata in India, and then begins an experiment in redrawing the proximities and distances of numerous world cities, each drawn into the same sized circle. Quote, "One day, when Tridib's atlas was lying open on my desk in my hostel room, quite by chance I happened to find a rusty old compass at the back of my drawer. It had probably been forgotten there by the person who lived in the room before me. I picked it up, toyed with it, placed its point in Khulna, and then the tip of the pencil in Srinagar. Khulna is not quite 100 miles from Kolkata as the crow flies. The two cities face each other at a watchful equidistance across the border. The distance between Khulna and Srinagar, or so I discovered when I measured the space between the points of my compass, was 1,200 miles, nearly 2,000 kilometers. It didn't seem like much, but when I took my compass through the pages of that atlas, on which I could still see smudges left by Tridib's fingers, I discovered that Khulna was about as far from Srinagar as Tokyo is from Beijing, or Moscow from Venice, or Washington from Havana, or Cairo from Naples. I then tried to draw a circle with Khulna at the center and Srinagar at the circumference. I discovered immediately that the map of South Asia would not be big enough. I had to turn back to the map of Asia before I found one large enough for my circle. It was an amazing circle. Beginning in Srinagar and traveling counterclockwise, it cut through the Pakistani half of Punjab, through the tip of Rajasthan and the edge of Sindh, through the Rann of Kutch, and across the Arabian Sea, through the southernmost toe of the Indian Peninsula, through Kandy in Sri Lanka, and out into the Indian Ocean until it emerged to touch upon the northernmost finger of Sumatra. Then straight through the tail of Thailand into the Gulf, it came out again in Thailand, running a little north of Phnom Penh, into the hills of Laos, past Hue in Vietnam, dipping into the Gulf of Tonkin, and then swinging up again through the Chinese province of Yunnan, past Chongqing, across the Yangtze Kiang, passing straight within sight of the Great Wall of China, through Inner Mongolia and Xinjiang, until, with a final leap over the Karakoram Mountains, it dropped again into the Valley of Kashmir. It was a remarkable circle. More than half of mankind had fallen within it. In this heuristic exercise, the narrator of the Shadow Lines imagines vastly different geocultural alignments and conglomerations, none necessarily more fantastic than the other. A whole new sense of region, of relation, is produced herein. And of course, this exercise invites us to replicate or vary such imaginative acts ourselves with our own atlases and compasses. To conclude, let me mention another novel by Ghosh that I'm sure has been referenced multiple times at this conference. Not only is it a rich and elaborate intertwined novel, but it also has GPS at its core, or at least one of its dual cores. I'm referring to his 2005 novel, The Hungry Tide. There is no way to convey the immense richness and complexity of this text, which might be said to follow two parallel projects: the mapping and chronicling of dolphins through the Sundarbans in West Bengal, India, heavily relying on GPS-equipped monitoring devices, and the retrieval of the lost history of the Marachapi massacre of 1979, when the newly elected Communist Party of India in West Bengal forcibly evicted thousands of Bengali refugees who had settled on the island of Marachapi. However, the retrieval of that specific event necessitates an even deeper excursion into the cultural, linguistic, historical, and mythic past of the region. just as the mapping of the movements of the dolphins requires a larger account of the general relations between human and non-human animals, the natural and built environments. Ghosh thus pushes into the foreground precisely issues of positions and systems, ecological, linguistic, mythic, historical, political. The products of these investigations are contained in two objects, but Ghosh powerfully suggests that while they are necessary, they are also just pretexts for sustained and committed work in the world. The text in which the prehistory of the region and the history of the massacre are embedded, a large journal kept by an old school teacher, is ultimately lost, but not before being embedded in the memory of the one man who inherits the document and incorporates that knowledge into his memory. It's no accident that he's a translator. What about the dolphins? All the data patiently and meticulously noted down in a ledger by the scientist Pia has been lost as well in the same storm that claimed the notebook. Yet her monitor is intact, and as she explains to her friend, quote, "This is connected to the satellites of the global positioning system. On the day of the storm, it was in my pocket. It was the only piece of equipment that survived. At the touch of a button, the screen flickered on. Pia tapped a key to access the memory. All the routes the fakir showed me are stored here." I'll close by saying that Ghosh makes these moves at the end of his novel not simply to offer compensation for the loss of the notebook or the ledger. Rather, the fact that the content of memory and information still remains and is accessible presents the receivers of memory with the obligation to be active agents in its being put to use. I would suggest in ending that a good use of our energies might be to perform acts not unlike those found in all the texts I've cited today, to imagine and to actually actively construct other worlds, perhaps by shifting the center a bit or maybe a lot. In sum, to return to Edward Said, we can newly imagine and meditate on how we engage the text and the world as critics. Thank you.